All right, so this next subunit is going to be on the human use of land. Our objectives are going to be to assess the effects of human land usage on an ecosystem, to compare and contrast ways that humans are working to reduce the impact of land use on the environment, and to describe possible future consequences of land use on the environment. So let's talk about land usage in ecosystems. Humans do strange things to ecosystems when they change the land. One of the things that we've done is we've created a thing called hedgerows. So these are primarily in the UK, but we also have them in the United States. But hedgerows are farmlands that are separated by rows of bushes. So they figured out that the farmlands were kind of displacing birds, mammals, reptiles, and insects and other plant species. So they decided that they needed to do something about that. So they created these little ecosystems called hedgerows in between farmlands. And you can see here in the picture we've got these large sections of bush, kind of forested areas in between farmlands. And these create a little shelter for displaced birds, mammals, reptiles, insects, and other plants. And it creates kind of a nice little ecosystem for them to be able to move around in. It doesn't quite fragment their habitat quite as much as we see in other areas. One thing that we do is rangeland. We create rangelands. And rangelands are lands used for the grazing of livestock. So we're talking goats, cattle, sheep. In Colorado, we have llamas, alpacas, antelope, all sorts of weird stuff. But a bad thing that happens with that is overgrazing can occur. And that's when too many ranchers let too many animals graze. And they typically let their animals graze on public lands. So it's kind of a beneficial thing. They put their animals on these lands. They control plants so that there's more diversity in the area. If they didn't have that, then there'd be just one main group of plants, say like a large grass breed would be pretty much the dominant species in that area. But with the grazing, they kind of create a diversity. So they make it so that the ecosystem can support many different types of plant species. The problem is when overgrazing occurs, and that's when more animals are grazing than the land can support. So they're taking away more than the land is putting back. And that alters the ecosystem. So many native species are going to emigrate. And emigration is when things migrate out of a system. Immigration is when they migrate into the system. Emigration is when they migrate out of the system. So here's a picture of sheep grazing. So we all know that we use timber for all sorts of products, paper, your house, all sorts of things, your pencil. But how we get the timber is what we're going to talk about here. So previously we would use clear cutting. And clear cutting is when you basically just cut all of the trees in a certain area. Doesn't matter what kinds, doesn't matter how old they are, just cut them all. Leave the stumps. And that's going to destroy ecosystems. Um, Essentially, it's because trees hold the ground together. So when you cut these trees, you just have these dead stumps, and they're not holding the ground anymore. They're just stuck there. They're just stuff along with the ground. So you're going to get soil erosion. We talked about how bad that is, and that's going to lead to land degradation. So that's going to take away the topsoil. We talked about that in Earth Science A, and we talked a little bit about it in the beginning of this unit, or of this course. So what we do now is selective cutting, which is picking certain trees in an area to cut down and leaving others. Typically, it's old growth and new growth. We'll cut down the old growth because it's had more time to grow. There's more mass within the old growth forests. And when you leave the new growth, it gives that new growth time to grow, become old growth. And as long as you're planting other plants with, or other trees when you cut down the old growth, then you'll have this continuous supply of new growth and old growth trees, and you'll create a sustainable ecosystem. So selective cutting leaves the ecosystem intact, and it makes it so that it can recover. The only problem is that it's a little more cost expensive. It's a lot more expensive. And when you're getting down to dollars and cents, a lot of people will just say, screw it and cut down all the trees. Luckily, the governments kind of regulate that nowadays. Some don't, like Brazil's really bad about that, but we're working on it. So, speaking of clear cutting, we have these deforestation practices. So, deforestation Selective cutting is also deforestation, but it's just a more sustainable way. But deforestation increases the amount of CO2 in the world by far because not only do trees sequester carbon, which means they suck it in from the air and they use that carbon to grow, carbon dioxide essentially, mainly. They use that carbon to grow, so they hold that into their system until they die. But also, the deforestation industry contributes to around 20% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. So if you think about that, not only are we increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we're decreasing the ability to take that carbon from the atmosphere by cutting trees down. And we're also losing a lot of oxygen. By doing that, we lose a lot of habitat for wildlife, and we add to that soil erosion and land degradation. So here's just a good picture of clear cutting. This whole mountainside it's lost it's like natural rebar. That's what the trees are doing. So it's this whole mountainside is going to erode, and this soil is going to become unfertile. It's going to be really low in nutrients. Not a lot of stuff's going to be able to live there. And then here's a graph of the annual deforestation in the Amazon and its resulting carbon dioxide emissions. So here are the carbon dioxide emissions in millions of tons. And then this green line is the trend line for annual deforestation. So it follows this carbon dioxide trend extremely, extremely closely, which generally means that there is a trend. So we also like our crops, we know that. So agriculture has a lot to do with human use of land and changing the land. So we're going to talk about pest control a little bit here. 33% of potential food is destroyed by insects yearly, which is a lot, but we also still have a surplus of food. So, if you think about it in those terms, it's not that crazy. But we use pesticides to control these pests. And pesticides can be harmful to beneficial plants and insects in the area, wildlife, and humans, maybe. It depends on what pesticide it is and how much you get in your system, but they can be harmful. So, one thing that happens with the use of pesticides is that you're going to get this natural evolution of insects. So, the natural selection is going to promote insects that are resistant to certain pesticides. So, eventually, you're going to get a pesticide that doesn't work on insects anymore because that whole population of insects has a gene that is resistant to the pesticide. So then you're going to have to, spend billions of dollars to find a new pesticide. Two things that are bad about agriculture are pollution, and pollution due to pesticides and pollution due to fertilizer runoff. So a good example is DDT, and that was a pesticide that we used back in the day. We found that it bioaccumulated in birds, typically like bald eagles, peregrine falcons, osprey, birds that were eating fish. So this pesticide went into the water, went into a stream. That stream went into a lake. That lake was full of this pesticide. All the fish in that lake sucked up that pesticide through their gills as they're going around into the water. And the only thing that those birds eat were these fish, and those fish were contaminated. So this pesticide pollutant kind of accumulated within these birds because that's all they were eating was this biomass of pesticide basically. And the idea of bioaccumulation is that it kind of accumulates from the bottom and it gets higher and higher and higher until the top. So humans are at the top. So if we start eating a lot of things with pesticides in them, it's going to accumulate in us greatly. Another thing is fertilizer runoff. We have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that's due to nitrogen and phosphorus running off from agricultural practices from the Mississippi River down into the Gulf of Mexico, and that promotes algal blooms. These algal blooms soak up all the oxygen in an area and make it so that all the fish die. They don't have oxygen in that area anymore. And one last thing about forests being clear cut is the United Nations states that 13,000 square kilometers of African forests are clear cut yearly. And this is great ape habitat. This also happens in Borneo, which is like where orangutans live, and they're great apes as well. But this habitat is being destroyed so quickly that it's estimated that they will be extinct within the next 20 years. So no more of these fellas if we don't stop our deforestation practices. So ways that we reduce impact. We have national parks. We have around 50 national parks in the United States. That's a quiz question. An example would be Yosemite, the Everglades, the Grand Canyon. And what they do is they protect land from development. And they set aside this land for public use and enjoyment. One thing about that is we can have oil rigs set up right outside of a national park and go under the national park and soak up all the oil from the area which should be the national park. So there are loopholes around that. Another place that we have is wilderness areas, and in wilderness areas, there's absolutely no development allowed. So we have around 475 of these in the United States. They're just places where it's really nice to hike, canoe, anything without like motors. You can go and play around in the wilderness. So a thing that we do to reduce impact is reforestation, and those are just tree planting projects. A lot of the times they're required by governments. Like I said, Brazil's not so great with it, but many governments are all about reforestation. So they try and counteract the deforestation by planting trees. They're mostly done by private and nonprofit groups to reestablish and maintain ecosystems. So here's a good picture of that. And another thing they do is biological pest control. So it's pest control without pesticides. So one example is companion planting. So tomatoes are a nightshade, which means that they produce toxin. And when tomatoes are together in a large group, they make a very toxic soil. So it reduces crop yield. A lot of those tomatoes are going to die. So what they do is they plant onions and leeks next to tomatoes and in between tomato rows to reduce that toxic effect, which greatly increases crop yield. We also have genetically modified plants that are resistant to pests. They're not going to kill you if you eat them. They're just resistant to these certain types of pests. And my favorite is ladybugs. Ladybugs love to eat aphids, which are pests, and they'll fly away when the plants are clean. You can't do this on a very large scale, but you can do it in your garden, and that's awesome. So here's a ladybug eating an aphid. It's pretty crazy. So we have environmental manipulation. We've been talking about it this whole time. We have some consequences of it. One unexpected consequence was the Green Revolution, which was when we decided to become an agricultural world. Some positives were we increased the initial crop yield really quickly, we got new crops, and our modern agriculture techniques really sprouted from this. Some negatives were that it required a large amount of water, fertilizer, and pesticides. So we talked about fertilizer and pesticides and how they pollute, and then just taking water from a system is never a good thing. So the overuse of fertilizer and pesticides reduced crop yield over time. It really screwed up the topsoil as well. And it cost the economy lots of money over time to try and fix these problems and reclaim the area. So a good example of reducing the impact of our farming is the California Rice Lands Habitat Partnership. So this was a response to California's dwindling wetlands, and wetlands are really important for a number of reasons. They're important for flood control, pollution control, and they're really good habitats for niche species, so species that pretty much are only found in wetlands. And it was a cooperative effort between farmers, government agencies, and conservation groups. They promoted farming methods that would benefit wetland-dependent species, so these niche species, and rice fields were promoted because rice fields are pretty much a big wetland. These rice fields were inundated with water even in the off seasons so that they provided shelter for many wetland species and many wetland birds. And these migratory birds ate around 200 million pounds of excess rice crop. So the crop that's kind of like not being used anymore, the birds would come and they would eat that crop. They would walk around the rice paddies and that would till the soil for the farmers. So that was easier and cheaper than tilling and fertilizing the soil every year because not only would they till the soil, but they'd poop in the soil. And that's a really good fertilizer is guano. So that's just something to think about. This is definitely going to be on the quiz. So take a look at this. And then here's a nice picture of some sandhill cranes walking around in a rice field. So they're just tilling the soil up, they're pooping, adding fertilizer to the system, and they're eating, any sort of little critters that were living in the rice paddy at that time. And they were also eating excess rice crop. So they do a lot of really good things. All right, so that is the end of the slide. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful week.